This is Dr. Gary Siskin, and this is the first of 5 lectures on the uterine fibroid embolization procedure. Part 1 of this series regards patient selection for the procedure. Fibroids are the most common smooth muscle tumors of the uterus, and they affect approximately 20 to 40% of women 35 years and older. They affect approximately 25 million women in the United States, and 25% are symptomatic enough to see their doctor. Almost a third to a half of the hysterectomies done in the United States every year are due to fibroids. There are several risk factors for fibroids. African American women have an increased risk, and up to 80% may develop fibroids. Increasing parity is associated with a decreased risk of fibroids. Early menarche and the use of oral contraceptives before the age of 16 are associated with an increased risk, and increased consumption of fruit, vegetables, and low-fat dairy products are associated with a reduced risk, and a high BMI is associated with an increased risk. Typically, fibroids are classified based on their location within the uterus. Submucosal fibroids develop under the lining of the endometrial cavity and can grow into the cavity, and this can cause abnormal bleeding. Intramural fibroids develop within the wall of the uterus and are the most common type. These often cause bulk-related symptoms as well as abnormal bleeding as they enlarge. And subserosal fibroids develop on the outer wall of the uterus and can grow outward from the uterus. These often cause bulk-related symptoms as they put pressure on surrounding organs. Patients being considered for the UFE procedure must be initially assessed by an interventional radiologist. Nobody should be able to order a UFE. It's best if this assessment takes place in a dedicated outpatient office, which I think many of us believe is a mandatory part of contemporary IR practice. When you see a patient in your office, you first have to assess the symptoms that the patient's experiencing due to their fibroids. And the reason for this is that we tend not to offer a UFE to patients without fibroid-related symptoms. These symptoms generally include menorrhagia, or heavy, prolonged menstrual bleeding, dysmenorrhea, or severe menstrual cramping, pelvic pressure and discomfort, excessive abdominal fullness or bloating, pelvic pain, dyspareunia or pain during intercourse, and then urinary symptoms such as urgency, frequency, nocturia, or retention. I think it's important for us to determine if the patient's fibroids are responsible for the symptoms they're experiencing. In other words, do the symptoms being reported make sense, given the size and location of the fibroids that are present within the uterus? Once it's been determined that the patient's clinical symptoms can be attributed to their fibroids, it's then important to document the presence of fibroids with an imaging examination. Physical exam is not enough, and ultrasound and MRI tend to be the most commonly used options to further investigate fibroids. Ultrasound is usually the initial imaging study performed in patients with fibroids. Fibroids appear to be a well-defined mass with an echogenicity that can vary, but it's usually hypoechoic relative to normal myometrium. In postmenopausal women, dystrophic calcifications can be seen, and there may be increased peripheral vascularity on Doppler imaging. The problem with ultrasound is that the images are operator-dependent and patient-dependent, and it can be difficult to differentiate between fibroids and other pathology, such as ovarian tumors, endometrial tumors, and adenomyosis. An MRI can be more helpful in these situations. So besides being more sensitive than ultrasound in diagnosing and distinguishing these other causes of pelvic pain and other symptoms, MRI is more accurate than ultrasound in evaluating the size, number, and location of fibroids. It can also be helpful in assessing the vascular supply and collateral vasculature of fibroids, and it can potentially be used to predict treatment response, treatment failure, and fibroid recurrence. There have been several attempts made to use pre-procedure MRI findings in order to assess patient prognosis with fibroid embolization. Attempts have been made to use the findings on a pre-procedure MRI to assess patient prognosis after fibroid embolization. For example, the signal intensity ratio between the dominant fibroid and surrounding striated muscle on pre-procedure T2-weighted images has been shown to be significantly related to dominant fibroid volume reduction after fibroid embolization. Pre-treatment vascularity of the fibroids, as determined by measuring the degree of enhancement compared with myometrium, may also help predict outcomes. Patients with high vascularity fibroids may actually have an increased risk of recurrence. And finally, insufficient fibroid infarction can be seen in patients with smaller fibroids and with fibroids located in the cervix, lower body, or anterior wall of the uterus. As I've mentioned, MRI is also helpful for diagnosing adenomyosis. This is the benign presence of ectopic endometrial glands and stroma causing a reactive hypertrophy of the smooth muscle within the myometrium. It's usually diagnosed on MRI since it results in junctional zone thickening greater than 12 millimeters on T2-weighted imaging. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because adenomyosis can lead to nonspecific symptoms that are similar to those seen with uterine fibroids, and this includes abnormal bleeding, pain, and bulk-related symptoms. It also matters because embolization may be a controversial treatment choice for adenomyosis. Early studies reported that adenomyosis may be associated with treatment failure, potentially leading to subsequent hysterectomy. With that said, more recent results have been favorable, with short-term and long-term symptomatic improvement, but recurrence rates are still higher than those seen in patients with fibroids and no adenomyosis. This recent data supports embolization as a treatment option to hysterectomy in patients with adenomyosis. It should not be considered an absolute contraindication to embolization. What about cancer? Well, the reported incidence of sarcomatous degeneration of fibroids is less than 1%, and there's no established criteria for distinguishing a sarcoma from a fibroid. Suspicion can be raised in a patient with a rapid increase in size of a presumed fibroid, especially in a postmenopausal patient. It's important to follow patients closely after fibroid embolization to identify patients that haven't responded appropriately, since that may be indicative of sarcomatous degeneration. When seeing patients in the office, many frequently ask if they can be considered for fibroid embolization if they have large fibroids. Tumor size has not been shown to be a factor in predicting successful outcomes after embolization, and patients with large fibroids should not be excluded from fibroid embolization. In practice, most patients with large fibroids are satisfied with their outcome. Pedunculated fibroids have been raised as an issue. It's been suggested that there is some increased risk when treating patients with pedunculated fibroids. As a result, it's important that pre-procedure imaging make note of any pedunculated fibroids so that appropriate decision-making can be done. In the case of subserosal fibroids, there's been 2 reported cases of septic pedunculated subserosal fibroids requiring surgery, one of which required a partial bowel resection. And when approaching subserosal fibroids, the conservative approach is to offer fibroid embolization if the stalk diameter is greater than 2 centimeters, but you can probably get away with being more aggressive than that. In the case of submucosal pedunculated fibroids, there are associated risks in terms of transcervical expulsion and possible infection. And when evaluating these patients, you should make note of the stalk diameter. It should be greater than 45% of the fibroid diameter, and this will help prevent fibroids from becoming intracavitary after embolization. So in general, pay attention to the imaging findings on MRI, especially those that concern pedunculated fibroids, and specifically look for the size of the stalk relative to the size of the fibroid. And that information will enable you to make the right decision concerning the candidacy of a patient with pedunculated fibroids for embolization. Sometimes we're asked to consider fibroid embolization in older postmenopausal women, and embolization can be effective in this setting. In one study, the uterine arteries were large enough for performing embolization, because that may be a concern. Patients with submucosal fibroids and abnormal bleeding were effectively treated, and embolization was able to address bulk-related symptoms in these patients. However, bleeding patients still require an endometrial biopsy to evaluate for an underlying malignancy or endometrial hyperplasia. Fertility remains a big question when it comes to fibroid embolization, and it remains to be determined if embolization is a good option for patients wishing to preserve their fertility options. There are a couple of things we know. We know that fibroids themselves can cause decreased pregnancy rates and increased miscarriage rates. Myomectomy has been considered the treatment of choice for women wishing to preserve fertility. However, multiple large fibroids in an unfavorable position may be difficult or impossible to surgically remove without impacting fertility, and therefore patients are looking for less invasive treatment options. We also know that fertility preservation after embolization has been an issue since the procedure was first reported, and this includes the ability to get pregnant and the ability to carry a pregnancy to term. This meta-analysis showed that pregnancies can happen after fibroid embolization, but it also showed that pregnancy-related issues can happen after UFE as well. And the basis for concern is that miscarriages, abnormal placentation, preterm delivery, and malpresentation have all been reported after fibroid embolization. In addition, embolization may impact ovarian blood flow, leading to premature menopause. We also know that fibroid embolization can cause uterine necrosis and infections that might require a hysterectomy. UFE may also affect endometrial receptivity and implantation. And finally, UFE can reduce ovarian reserve, which can lead to infertility. There is one prospective randomized trial evaluating fertility after fibroid embolization and myomectomy, and this study, performed back in 2008, evaluated 121 patients with an intramural fibroid greater than 4 centimeters in diameter. 58 of those patients underwent UFE, and 63 underwent myomectomy. This study showed that myomectomy had superior reproductive outcomes at 2 years. A more recent meta-analysis was performed in 2018. Carlson concluded that the pregnancy rate was 50% after fibroid embolization and 78% after myomectomy. In addition, this group showed that the miscarriage rate was 60% after fibroid embolization and 20% after myomectomy. And given the low quality of evidence, the authors did not recommend any changes with existing guidelines and concluded that UFE is not recommended as first-choice treatment for women planning a future pregnancy. The challenge is that it's difficult to determine if pregnancy outcomes after embolization are the result of the procedure or are a result of the extent of disease, prior interventions, or other patient factors such as advanced maternal age. And if there are embolization-related issues, are they caused by the remaining fibroid mass? Are they due to issues such as post-UFE endometrial or ovarian injury? And would changes in technique impact outcomes? So for now, myomectomy should be offered to patients who are good surgical candidates and desire future fertility. And the desire for future fertility should not be a contraindication to fibroid embolization. It's probably best used for patients who've had a prior myomectomy, who were less than ideal surgical candidates, or who wish to avoid surgery. Any office-based discussion revolving around UFE has to include some mention of the other treatment options for fibroids. Remember, there's no evidence to support the routine treatment of asymptomatic fibroids. Much of this discussion revolves around hysterectomy. This is the only treatment that prevents fibroid recurrence and treats concomitant diseases. However, concern has been raised about the overuse of this procedure. Routes of hysterectomy include abdominal, vaginal, and laparoscopic. And remember that an endoscopic approach is associated with decreased morbidity, but this benefit has to be weighed against the risk of disseminating undiagnosed cancer when power morcellation is used for specimen removal. UFE is one of several uterine-sparing procedures, and these should be reviewed as well with women considering treatment for fibroids. They include myomectomy, which can be open, laparoscopic, or hysteroscopic, endometrial ablation, embolization, and MR-guided focused ultrasound. Myomectomy is not usually considered in patients who are not considering future pregnancy. An estimated 15 to 33% of fibroids recur after myomectomy. In other words, approximately 10% of women undergoing myomectomy may undergo a hysterectomy within 5 to 10 years. Medical therapy should be reviewed as well, and many patients will come to you already on medical therapy. Combined and progesterone-only oral contraceptives may decrease the risk of developing clinically significant fibroids. Combined oral contraceptives may also control irregular and heavy bleeding associated with fibroids, but they don't have much impact on size. The Mirena device is a T-shaped IUD sheathed with a reservoir of progesterone that's slowly released, and it works by preventing endometrial proliferation, reducing both the duration of bleeding and the amount of menstrual blood loss. It's effective for controlling the bleeding associated with fibroids, but there have been conflicting results concerning its effect on fibroid size. So there are several options today for treating patients with fibroids. This algorithm was published in 2015 in the New England Journal of Medicine by Stewart, and it's still referred to as a reasonable way to think about the different options for fibroids, and I include it here for your reference. So in conclusion, patient selection is an important component of the UFE procedure. An office-based consultation will allow any physician performing this procedure to appropriately assess patients in order to make sure that they will benefit from embolization and that it's the right thing to do.